Welcome to Shredder Fanfic. Like, subscribe, and hype video. Join members to gain early access to new videos. The main character, after dying in his previous life, gets reborn inside of How to Train Your Dragon, or HTTYD, and he is reborn as a Foreverwing. What will the Foreverwing do inside of How to Train Your Dragon?
Of its den. Not for instruction. For acknowledgement. I did not sit. I pressed one claw into the stone. And shaped one vine. Just one. Wound it carefully through the wall it had made. Not correcting. Supporting. The den held firmer now. And I left it that way. When I turned to leave, it didn't follow. It curled back into its sanctuary and stared at the sea. And the island recognized it. That ridge, long empty, had changed. Not from my breath. From its own roots. By midday, other dragons had begun to approach the glade. Not many. Just a pair of natters and a small gronkel, curious. They circled once, saw the hatchling's den, and didn't land. But they would return. They always did. A dragon who builds alone draws attention. Not fear. Respect. Chapter 23, The Skybreaker Comes. He came at dawn, flying low and fast. Not like a dragon on patrol. Like a dragon returning with something too big for silence. The adolescent storm cutter circled once above the central grove, then landed hard near my eastern rootbed. No dragons followed. His wings were half spread, not in exhaustion but in tension. His breath came quiet, but firm. He didn't speak. He just pressed his presence into mine through the soil. Urgent. I stepped forward. He projected again, wordless, but clear. He had seen something. East of the vine path. Beyond the glowing garden. Past the far line of my influence. The air there had no roots in it. Nothing of mine had reached so far yet. But something was coming from beyond it. A dragon. Alone. Flying low. Massive. Scarred. Unmarked by patrol or flame. And it didn't answer any signal. I reached into the moss beneath us and traced his path backward. The adolescent had flown high above the far chain of outer islands, windless, bare, unshaped stone. They were meant to be unreachable still, until the second Foreverwing and I could link the soil. This dragon had come from beyond them. Unclaimed territory. Wounded sky. I sent out a presence call, subtle. Not a roar. Not a challenge. Just an echo of the alpha. No response. The stranger didn't answer. But it turned. Now flying toward us. Directly. I stood still for a moment, let the information settle. Then I turned and moved to the eastern arch where my vines still pulsed faintly with the hum of the glowing garden, and beyond it, the vine path I had begun carving toward the sea. I walked the length of it slowly. Then lifted off and flew. The sky above the eastern islands was quiet. No scouts followed. No dragons lingered. Even the winds here had fallen still. I reached the end of my shaped path and hovered. Waited. Then I felt it. A low vibration. Not through the soil. Through the air. Wings. Not thin. Not fast. Heavy. I turned toward the rising sun. And saw it. A dragon broke the line of the light, larger than a natter, leaner than a scaldron, but not shaped for speed. It had long wings, torn in several places. Its back was lined with scar tissue, old and hard. Its tail was broken at the tip, split into two jagged spines. It didn't roar. It didn't speak. It just flew. Straight at me. It carried no flame. No ice. No acid. But its breath was raw. Not sharp. Not new. Old. I reached downward into the roots beneath me, but there were none here. Only shallow stone. No vines. No moss. Just sky and stone. And still, I stepped forward in the air. Hovered. Waited. The dragon slowed as it neared me. Then stopped. Its wings didn't flap. They extended and caught the wind like a glider. It stared at me. And I stared back. Not alpha to alpha. Not hunter to prey. Just center to wanderer. Then it tilted its head. And I saw it. Its eyes. White on black. Not blind. Burned. Not from battle. From light. And in its presence, I felt it. Not challenge. Not submission. Just, exhaustion. It hovered a few seconds longer, then began to descend. Not crash. Descent. Controlled. It landed on a flat section of stone just outside my root line. Then curled its tail and sat. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't bow. But it waited. And that meant something. I descended after it, touched down slowly. Let my presence settle across the stone. Still no response. But it didn't resist either. I stepped forward and exhaled once, let the breath ripple across the dead soil. No growth responded. But the dragon inhaled. And closed its eyes. A slow breath. And I understood. It wasn't attacking. It was seeking shelter. No dragon that powerful crossed open sky unless it was looking for something it had lost. Not dominance. Not food. Belonging. I pressed my claw to the stone again and offered one curl of moss a test, a breath-shaped marker. The moss took slowly. But it held. And the stranger didn't react. Didn't resist. Just watched. Let me shape. Let the roots take hold near its claws. It was letting me claim the soil around it. Not submission. Permission. That was enough. By the time I returned to the garden, the adolescent storm cutter was already circling low, waiting. I landed beside him. He didn't speak. Just met my eyes. Is it war? I shook my head once. No. He's not a threat. Not yet. But he came from far. And far always brings stories. Chapter 24, Beneath the Spiral Stone. The hatchling's glade was thriving. Its vines had stabilized. Moss beds now circled the crooked tree it had chosen as a center. Natters passed by during the windless hours, and young Grand CKLs nested nearby without asking. Not as subordinates. As neighbors. It was the sign I had been waiting for, the hatchling no longer needed protection. It had grown a center of its own. Which meant the island's last wild root needed to answer me. The screaming death. It had lingered in silence since the encounter with the hatchling, surfacing rarely, rising only to feed or survey its spiral tunnels. It had not challenged my patrols. Had not approached the glowing garden. But it also had not acknowledged me. Not in submission. Not in defiance. Just absence. That would not continue. It wasn't about power. It was about order. There was no place for uncertainty in a forest this large, with roots spreading toward new islands and dragons seeking shape and guidance. Everything beneath my reach must bend. Even the unbroken spiral. Even the lone fury beneath the stone. I left before dawn, when the forest was cool and the wind had not yet risen. The patrols did not follow. I moved alone. Past the eastern glade, through the ridge paths, into the old basin scarred by collapsed stone where the soil changed texture and moss no longer grew wild. The ground here had no give, only hard-packed mineral dust and veins of cooled lava stone that made even the air taste metallic. This was his home. Carved by instinct. Lived in by force. The tunnel mouth opened a head wide, low, slick with condensation. A spiral trench, long and hollow, curving downward into dark earth. The sound of wind vanished here. Even the birds above had stopped their calls. I stepped into the tunnel. And the roots followed. The descent took time. Stone curved in narrowing rings, each tighter than the last. The walls bore scars, claw marks, head swipes, and the unmistakable ridges of body movement repeated hundreds of times. This wasn't a den. It was a burrowed legacy. At the 30th spiral, the tunnel widened. I stopped. The moss under my claws had long since vanished. Even my breath moved slower here. Not blocked. Muted. He was waiting. I felt him just ahead, crouched low in the largest hollow, his resting chamber. A space shaped not for comfort, but for resonance. The walls were smooth. The air unmoving. The echo of breath alone felt like a roar. And still, he said nothing. I entered the hollow. He didn't rise. Not immediately. His body uncoiled slowly from the center, winding across the curved wall like a living sculpture of stone and scale. His wings flicked once half-folded, massive. His tail curled in a perfect spiral around his center. His eyes locked on me. Pale. Unblinking. I let my breath fall into the soil just lightly. Not shaping. Not commanding. Not yet. He hissed. Low. A vibration. Not warning. Recognition. He knew why I was here. I stepped forward and pressed both claws into the stone. It didn't move. I didn't ask it to. He uncoiled. Fully. No fanfare. No roar. Just weight and intent. Then he charged. There was no speech. No build-up. No challenge. Only collision. He moved faster than anything that size should. The tunnel vibrated before his scream even rose. A wall of sound struck me from 10 meters away, hitting not my body but the air around it. Pressure collapsed into a weapon. I braced. Roots surged upward, not to strike him. To hold me still. The scream rolled across my flank, split stone, tore a gash along my shoulder, but I didn't fall. I pushed forward. He struck. Fangs met bark. His mouth clamped around my crest, not to kill. To silence. But I surged upward, let my vines drive into the tunnel ceiling and pull. Stone cracked. He staggered. I dropped onto his back, wrapped forelegs around his torso, and drove him down. He screamed again. This time directly into the stone. The chamber shook. My ears rang. But I didn't retreat. I pressed down harder, coiled vines into his ribs, and let roots grow from the floor. Live ones. Slow. Thick. They reached upward, past stone. Toward him. He felt it. His limbs spasmed once. The sound stopped. His body thrashed. Then stilled. The roots wrapped gently across his spine, under his wings. Not constriction. Contact. I pressed my breath into the floor. And spoke. Not in words. In presence. You will not be cast out. You will not be silenced. You will not be wild. You will be part. You will belong. He did not answer. Not at first. But he didn't scream again. Not in rage. He screamed upward. Through the stone. Into the sky. The tunnel shook. The spiral wall echoed his voice like a drum of thunder. Then silence. And then. The roots took. Fully. Not rejected. Accepted. His breath slowed. His claws unfurled. And he bowed his head. Only once. Then curled his tail not in a spiral, but a loop. Smaller. Yielding. Present. I stepped off his back. Watched him rise. He didn't roar. He simply turned toward the tunnel wall and carved a new path with one long breath. Not downward. Upward. Toward the surface. Toward the rest of us. The screaming death emerged before nightfall. The dragons who saw him backed away. Not in fear. In awe. He circled the basin once. Then landed beneath the northern ridge. And curled there. Not in isolation. In service. Not silent. But still. Chapter 25, The Stone Remembers. I felt the air shift before I saw the tunnel. The screaming death had carved it with precision, spiral-fused stone cut with the pressure of his scream, not torn by claw or fang. It started in the base of his den and stretched upward, but not toward the open air. Not directly. The angle was wrong. Too steep. Too narrow for flight. It curved into the cliffside beneath the northern ridge, into stone I had not shaped. He hadn't opened it for wind. He had opened it for me. I entered alone. The moss did not grow here. No vines. No root veins. The walls were solid, untouched by my shaping. But the stone felt warm. Not from heat. From history. I walked. The tunnel twisted slowly downward before leveling. The air became heavier with every step. Not stale. Not decayed. Just thick. As if the rock remembered what it had once been. The curve of the walls sharpened. The ceiling dropped. And then I found it. A chamber. Perfectly round. Not hollowed out by claw. Formed. The air inside had not moved in generations. My breath stirred dust that should not have existed, ash fine, suspended midair. The walls pulsed faintly with temperature changes I couldn't track. Not cold. Not heat. Just presence. I stepped into the center. The floor was smooth, carved intentionally. And in its heart, embedded in the stone, lay a disc. Not of wood. Not vine. Not shaped by any dragon I had ever seen. Stone ringed in metal. Etched in markings. I lowered my head. Pressed my breath against it. The disc did not glow. It vibrated. Softly. Then the walls began to move. Not physically. The dust swirled, gathering along the edges of the chamber. Not into form. Into pattern. Old carvings beneath the dust began to show deep ridges cut into the stone like roots fossilized into the very walls. Not writing. Memory. 3 spirals. 1 large. 2 smaller. Joined by branching veins. Foreverwing. Screaming death. And something else. Something missing. I pressed deeper. My breath found no life here. But it found story. This chamber wasn't built by accident. It wasn't natural. It was intended. Long before me. Long before this forest had risen. This was a convergence point. A place shaped to hold dragons, not for rest. For connection. The walls hummed once more. Then the carvings deepened just slightly. I saw more. Dragons circling one another, not in battle, but in orbit. Lines between them, etched downward, into stone. Below the chamber. There was more beneath. I lowered my claws and exhaled into the floor. Pressed the soil beneath the smooth surface. It answered. Softly. A path curved downward, sealed, but present. Old. Waiting. I did not open it. Not yet. This was not a place for unshaped breath. This was legacy. And whatever had shaped this chamber. It had expected me. I rose and turned back to the entrance. The screaming death waited outside the tunnel mouth. He had not followed. But his breath met mine as I stepped out. A projection. Clear. Firm. I did not build it. I found it. I chose to live beside it. He had lived next to memory. By instinct. By gravity. And now it was mine. I looked past him, toward the wide basin of the island. The vines at the far edge pulsed with energy. A new vine bridge had just connected to the neighboring cliff. The second Foreverwing's shaping. The island was spreading. And now it had a root beneath it that went deeper than any of us. HTTYD, what if I am the Foreverwing? Chapter 26, The War of Lightning and Root. We felt the sky change before we saw the island. It began with pressure air tightening over the sea, not from weather, but from something alive. I was flying the edge of the eastern vine path when it struck me, a pulse through the clouds like a silent scream, too focused to be thunder. It slid over the ridge of my back and curled into the base of my wings, not painful, just heavy. Charged. The adolescent storm cutter noticed it too. He broke formation immediately, wings banking into the wind, eyes scanning the horizon. His feathers rose at the edge of his neck like instinct had just touched the back of his skull. Then we saw the light. A flicker on the edge of the ocean, no fire, no glow. Just a split-second rip in the storm cloud above a distant crag of stone. It didn't reach the water. It vanished into it. Like lightning turned inward. I extended my wings and descended toward the second Foreverwing's ridge, where the shaping vines had already begun curling across a newly exposed chain of islands. The path was still thin, unstable. But the signal was too strong to wait. I flew east. Across open water. Over 3 miles of sea. Then found the storm. It wasn't rain. It was the skrill. The island was a crescent rock heavy, no true canopy, just bursts of wind-warped trees, and cliffs lined in burn marks. The sky above it churned without thunder. Lightning circled but never struck. They were controlling it. 6, maybe 8 in the first scan. Slender bodies. Wings veined with electric light. Tails spiked. Their flight wasn't erratic, it was vibrating, moving faster than the eye could follow. And above them all. One larger than the rest. The Alpha. It perched on a column of split stone, wings half folded, tail dragging sparks across the rock, and its eyes turned toward me before I even made my presence known. It didn't roar. It shaped the air. And every skrill in the sky stopped. They hovered. All eyes locked on me. Waiting. This was territory. Undisputed. Unchallenged. Until now. I landed on the cliffside, soil sparking beneath my claws. My presence reached into the stone, but the roots here were old, brittle, foreign. I couldn't shape them without force. Which meant I had one path. Claim. The Alpha Skrill opened its wings and launched. Fast. I didn't move. I waited. The sky split above me, lightning dancing behind his wings, the storm itself pulled with him as he descended. The younger skrills spiraled outward, forming a loose ring around the island's heart. He crashed into the stone 2 meters in front of me, sparks exploding from his claws. And screamed. Not from his lungs. From the sky. A bolt of violet light shot upward, curled into the cloud bank, and returned behind him, shattering against the stone. Then he charged. We met mid-air. His body was smaller, quicker. Wings sharper. Tail edged in metal plates. But I was heavier. I pulled the wind from beneath us and let us drop into the lower basin, slamming him into the rocks. He twisted in the fall, exhaled a blast of charged air that skipped off my flank, searing moss from my crest. I surged forward and wrapped a vine around his right wing, thick, green, drawn from the shaping breath I had held just long enough. He shrieked, tail spinning, sparks flying across my chest, igniting half-formed moss. I planted both claws into the stone and let the roots curl upward. Not slow. Now. The island bent. Just for a moment. Enough. A wall of hardened bark snapped up between us. He struck it full force. Dropped. I didn't wait. I descended on him. Teeth first. Not to kill. To break the challenge. I caught his left shoulder, drove him into the stone, wrapped both forelegs around his torso, and pressed my breath into the ground. The roots took hold. They surged through the thin soil and curled around his limbs. Not to crush. To bind. The sky flickered above. The other squirrels shrieked but didn't move. Watching. Waiting. He thrashed. Once. Twice. Then went still. His wings dropped. His sparks dimmed. And he exhaled. Not a scream. Not a call. An answer. Low. Short. Submission. I released him. The vines uncurled. He rose slowly, limped back toward the high stone column, sparks still trailing from one wingtip, but eyes lowered. He turned. Faced his own. And screeched once. Short. Sharp. The sky above stopped moving. Not cleared. Calm. And then, one by one, the squirrel began to descend. Not toward him. Toward me. Circling. Lower. Wings angled in deference. The alpha had not just yielded. He had offered them. Not out of fear. Not out of loss. Out of recognition. By nightfall, the storm over the island had gone silent. I walked the ridge with my tail dragging through the soil, shaping new moss for rest, curling a seed line toward the next island. The squirrel watched from their perches. Still charged. Still wild. But now mine. They would not shape vines. They would not breathe into the earth. But they would guard it. Their storm would shelter my roots. And when the hatchling came, weeks from now, with cautious wings and a new spiral of vines to show, they would not scream. They would bow. Chapter 27, Lightning in the Roots. The storm hadn't broken. It had shifted. By the time the sun rose over the northern ridge, the moss across the storm island had begun to turn dark green, edges scorched from residual sparks, but not destroyed. The stone retained the charge longer than expected. Every root I planted across the island's perimeter responded slower, and every breath I sent into the shaping soil met resistance, not from rejection, but from interference. The storm was still here. Only now, it was mine. The alpha squirrel rested alone atop the tallest column of the crescent ridge. He no longer sparked when he exhaled. The glow along his flanks had faded to a steady pulse, like lightning waiting for rhythm. He did not bow when I passed, but he tilted his head each time I stepped near the stone, as if to ask, "What will you shape now?" And I had an answer. It began at the basin where I had defeated him, where my roots had first pierced the dry stone and grown moss fast enough to hold him in place. That crater, carved from the collision of my body and his charge, still held the shallow warmth of our breath. The soil was thin. Too dry to root vines deep. But not impossible. I turned toward the perimeter where the ring of smaller squirrels still circled the low cliffs. They watched in silence. Not ready to shape. Not curious. But willing. They responded to the alpha's surrender the way the adolescent storm cutter had once responded to mine, with obedience, not understanding. I didn't need understanding. Only stillness. I pressed my claws into the crater and inhaled once slow and long, not for power. For depth. I reached the roots I had left curled beneath the battle and began to grow them. Not vertically. Outward. Across stone. Between cracks. Vine against mineral. And the moment they reached the scorched line where his lightning had struck, they pulsed. Not burned. Absorbed. The moss twisted darker. Not black. Not dead. A kind of richness I hadn't seen since the glowing garden. It hardened beneath my claws not from bark, but from charge. The soil under the moss retained heat. Energy. I curled more roots outward. And the island began to respond. By dusk, the crater had changed. No longer barren. Not yet fertile. Just alive. A layer of moss circled the edges now shorter than the island's main forest, closer to ground cover than plant. The lightning that once surged through the rock had been turned inward by my shaping breath. It no longer sparked, but it shimmered lightless, but warm. I stepped back and shaped again one breath into the ridge above. A vine curled down the stone like a vein. Then pulsed. The skrill above twitched. Several rose, wings arcing. But the alpha called them back with one short screech, a ripple of breath through the wind. He understood. The shaping was not intrusion. It was foundation. By the second day, the moss across the crater glowed faintly in the dark. Only under pressure. Only when touched. A gronkel who wandered too far across the vine path stepped into the basin and froze. Her scales flickered with low light as she moved. Not burned. Not harmed. Charged. She retreated in silence, confused. But not afraid. The adolescent storm cutter came that night. He landed beside me, gaze scanning the air with practiced calm. His tail twitched once, tapping the edge of the crater. This land, it is no longer one thing. I didn't speak. I pressed a root upward and showed him. The moss bent under my breath. And sparked. Only lightly. The energy laced into it wasn't wild. It was storable. Carried like a secondary breath through the roots. Not fire. Not acid. Not storm. Just potential. He circled once. Then nodded. He understood. The island was becoming a conduit. I named it nothing. The storm didn't need a name. But the roots knew it. The vines across the shaping path to the main island began to harden, forming thin loops like arcs between them. At night, when the wind shifted, lightning curled through the clouds above but didn't strike. It lingered. Safe. Held. Directed. The skrill had not shaped anything directly. But their breath was now part of the island. Their flight curved around my shaping paths. Their alpha circled each new ridge I planted. And when I reached into the sky itself with a shaping breath, curling a single vine into the air as a living rod. It pulsed with stored energy the moment a storm broke above. Lightning, once wild, now fed the island. And the soil responded. The disk chamber beneath the northern ridge hadn't changed. But the resonance had. The next time I stood near it, the cymbals hummed faintly beneath my claws. Not awakened. Not active. But listening. The storm above had joined the network. The shaping was becoming something bigger than forest, bigger than grove. A system. Each dragon with breath. Each vine with memory. Each island with a pulse. And now. The storm belonged to me. Chapter 28, A Quiet Storm. The alpha skrill never roared. Even after surrender, even once the lightning bent to my shaping breath, he did not lift his voice into the sky again. He ruled through presence. Through charge. Through silence. Most dragons shouted their claim. He made the air bend around his body and let others feel it. Even now, days after the crater had been reshaped into a moss-rimmed basin capable of holding residual spark, he kept himself apart from the others. His kin roosted along the stone ridges and shallow cliffs of the storm island, but he remained alone atop the tallest pillar, half silhouetted against the lightning veins still drifting through the high cloud. Watching. Breathing. Waiting. I left the shaping paths that night and flew to him. The winds here were unnatural, not sharp, not violent, but full. A presence in every gust. The storm didn't rage anymore, but it never left. The pressure in the air moved like memory, not weather. He was standing when I arrived. He didn't bow. But he didn't rise in challenge. I landed opposite him, claws curling into the rock, the new moss between us faintly lit from below. He watched me. Then, for the first time, he moved. One wing curled outward, not fully stretched, angled so the membrane caught the wind. And he exhaled. Not from the chest. From his whole body. A shaping breath, not into the roots. Into air. The charge hit me in the center of the head, not as an attack. As invitation. I pressed my claws down. Let my breath curl beneath us. I felt no roots. But I felt him. Not in words. In memory. It wasn't a projection. Not a story. More like sensation. A spiral of instinct. He showed me a place far to the west. Not in images. In weight. Islands. Not green. Bare. Broken. Ridges of black stone lined with iron marks. Not nests. Not dens. Places carved by sky fire. He had lived there. Not with a family. Alone. Even then. The memory he shared next was sharper. A dragon, a monstrous nightmare larger than any I had seen in this lifetime, circling high above a cliff. It screeched, "Dove!" He had met it in the open air. The battle lasted seconds. One scream. One flash. And then the nightmare fell, body blackened by a blast of raw lightning. The skrill had not screamed. He had watched it fall. And then waited. For another. None came. That's what he showed me, silence, not from fear. Silence because none dared follow. He had lived alone since then. Not by choice. By effect. Every dragon who came to claim the sky around his storm had vanished in smoke and breath. He had not sought rule. But he had never been defeated. Until me. He turned his head slowly, as if measuring the moment again. I did not speak. He had shown the truth. He had been alpha before me, but his alphahood was born of isolation, not structure. His strength was a repellent. No community. No vines. No soil. Only storm. He had surrendered not because I was stronger. But because I had shaped what he could not. He had power. I had order. And now they were joined. He curled his tail. Slowly. Not to rest. To acknowledge. And this time when he breathed, he released a thin arc of lightning into the open sky. It did not strike the stone. It shaped the wind. A signal. The other skrill answered immediately. 3 loops above. 4 behind. Wings angled. Breath held. They were no longer wild sparks. They were mine. By the time I returned to the main island, the adolescent storm cutter was already waiting by the ridge, watching the horizon. He didn't speak. He only said, after a pause. The sky listens to you now. And I nodded. Yes. But not because I commanded it. Because it had finally found a place to land. Chapter 29, The Word Beneath Ash. It came just after midnight. The winds were calm, rare for the ridge, and the moss lay quiet across the glowing garden. The ground dragon had curled beneath the mineral-barked tree, his breath slow, his body humming in a way that still shaped the soil even while he slept. The hatchling had not returned from the storm island yet. The adolescent storm cutter was patrolling the eastern vine paths, his wing beats faint and rhythmic. And then the sky broke. No sound. No wind. Just impact. I felt it before I heard it, pressure collapsing against the western ridge, not from breath or shaping, but from weight. A dragon fell through the canopy near the southern border of the garden, striking vine and branch, slamming through two thick-rooted trees before landing in the wide clearing below. I moved before the moss had finished reacting. When I arrived, the scent of salt and ash was already thick in the air. The dragon was slumped against the center root bed, smaller than a natter, thinner than a storm cutter, wings too long for its frame. Its scales were dry and cracked, bearing signs of heat but no open wounds. It hadn't been attacked. It had been scorched. Not by fire. By cold. A kind of pressure that burned inward. Its eyes opened when I stepped into the clearing. One wing tried to lift. Failed. It didn't growl. Didn't flinch. It exhaled. Once. And the word came with the breath, not spoken, but shaped into the soil. Bewilder beast. Then the dragon collapsed. I stood over it for a long time. The moss beneath my claws had begun to twist from the heat in its skin, but not flame. A deep, unnatural cold, the kind that turned bark to stone and slowed shaping breath. This dragon had come from far south. Maybe farther. I sent out a presence call through the vine web that connected the eastern ridge to the storm island. The adolescent storm cutter returned within the hour, wings angled in concern, landing without sound near the edge of the fallen dragon's resting space. He tilted his head, took in the scent. And then his tail twitched sharply. He recognized the word. Not as story. As warning. He had flown above the eastern sea for years before he found me. He'd followed storm winds that never curved back. In his earliest projection, long before the Skrill arrived, he had seen a glacier moving through the ocean. Not floating. Walking. Shaped like an island. Breathing like a dragon. A creature that commanded others not by force, but by instinct. And now it was coming north. I turned my attention back to the fallen dragon. Its wings were twitching again. Breath shallow. No blood. But the soil around its claws was dry. Too dry. Even in the glowing garden. I pressed one shaping root into the ground and let it touch beneath the dragon's body. The soil shivered. Not from fear. From memory. This dragon had crossed a line of land that should not exist, uncharted, unshaped. It had flown above at least 4 broken islands, each bearing the same sign, silence. Not battle. Not fire. Extinction. I pulled the root back. Snapped it cleanly. Then I reached upward and shaped a moss bed large enough for the dragon's frame. The adolescent storm cutter helped, breath curling into the bark to harden it into a platform. We didn't speak. But we both knew. This dragon didn't come to fight. It came to warn. And the word it carried wasn't myth. It was motion. By dawn, the second Foreverwing had flown to the ridge. She hovered in silence, wings slow, gaze locked on the injured creature. She had not asked to join the shaping. But she stayed. And when I looked into her breath shaped long and slow through the moss, I saw a question neither she nor the storm cutter dared ask out loud. Will we hold this island together, if the ice comes? And I did not answer. Because the ice wasn't here yet. But the roots were ready. Chapter 30, When Alphas Gather. The moss hadn't finished pulsing when I sent the call. A single breath, shaped deep into the root line that stretched from the heart of the glowing garden to the storm island, to the eastern shaping paths, and down into the spiral dens below the northern ridge. No urgency. No alarm. Just certainty. The island shifted. Not with wind. Not with power. With attention. They all heard it. Not just the dragons who had bowed their heads or accepted shaping breath. The ones who had learned to listen. And when they came in order. The first was the adolescent storm cutter. He landed just outside the basin where the injured dragon slept, his wings tucked close, tail slow. He didn't speak. He moved to his usual place, to the right of the central root bed I had grown into a low rise of dark moss. From there he watched the path below. The ground dragon came next. He did not fly. He walked, rising from the edge of the mineral grove in silence, body humming with a deep and continuous energy that left the moss glowing in his footprints. His breath carried the same faint static as the charged vines of the storm island. He said nothing. He never did. But his breath curled beneath mine when he arrived, and we merged, shaping the edge of the basin into a ringed slope, low and thick-rooted. A place to hold presence. Then the second Foreverwing arrived. Not flying directly. She shaped her path across the vine bridges slowly, without pause. Her body was heavier than mine, her wings wide but less used. She did not roar. When she reached the basin, she stopped opposite the storm cutter and let her breath press into the roots there. We had never named our places. But this was a council. And last, the Alpha Skrill came. Low from the storm island, wings gliding without spark, but the pressure behind him curled the treetops for miles. The clouds above him followed. His breath had learned silence long ago. He landed on the far edge of the slope, beneath a tree I had shaped during the first weeks of the garden. And we were all there. 4 dragons of shaping breath and memory. 4 dragons who had submitted. Not to rule. To unity. The injured dragon lay beneath the moss bed still, unconscious. But the word had not left the soil. It pulsed beneath our claws now, faint and cold. Bewilder beast. I did not repeat it. They had all felt it. The ground dragon's hum shifted, deepening. It touched the moss on my left flank and held it. The adolescent storm cutter narrowed his wings, his tail still. His breath projected outward, shaping the wind in symbols. He showed an image. A glacier, moving. Not drifting. Swimming. And from its back dragons, clustered. Eyes blank. Hearts silent. No independence. No breath of their own. And around them, ice. Cold and vast. A shaping not of life but of control. It was not like me. It was not like us. It was something older. Something that didn't ask to be followed. It commanded. The second Foreverwing responded next. She projected not forward but downward, into the soil. An image of the shaping chamber beneath the ridge. The disk. The memory. She had never touched it. But she had felt it. And now she linked it to the cold. Not with proof. With pattern. The way the roots refused to grow too deep in some places. The way the soil around the storm island still vibrated with old presence, even after the Skrill had been tamed. She believed the shaping chambers across the islands were once part of a wider system. One created in resistance. Not by dragons like us. But against something like that. The Alpha Skrill tilted his head. His breath didn't shape. He just exhaled slow, into the open air. And the clouds above rolled back. One thin strike of lightning arced behind him. Then he sent a pulse into the moss between us. He projected a single memory. Himself. Circling above a black island. Deserted. Not burned. Frozen. He had not landed. He had turned back. But the clouds there had not moved since. An entire land held under breath that did not allow choice. I stood in silence. Let each of their breaths settle into the ring. And then I shaped. Not from air. From soil. My breath pressed into the moss bed beneath us, and the roots below it hardened into a wide circle of darkened bark. I shaped a vine, upward one only, and wrapped it around a small, living stone pulled from the crater on the storm island. It sparked once. Then held still. Balance. My reply. We would not move in fear. But we would not wait for silence to swallow us. We would prepare. That night, the council disbanded without word. The adolescent storm cutter took the eastern sky again. The Skrill returned to his island but flew higher. The second Foreverwing did not leave. She shaped new vines across the southern border of the garden. A wall. Subtle. But present. The ground dragon curled beside the mineral grove. And the word still pulsed beneath the moss. Bewilder beast. Not myth. Not now. Chapter 31, Flight over Dead Waters. I chose the storm cutter. Not because he was the fastest, though he was. Not because he'd patrolled farther than any dragon on the island, though he had. I chose him because he understood the difference between movement and message. His presence spoke before his wings ever beat. And that mattered more than speed. I shaped a ring of root in the basin below the glowing garden and summoned him at dawn. He arrived without hesitation, his wing beats soft against the still cooling air. The clouds above the island were low remnants of the Skrill's passive storm, but the wind was dry. The island was breathing deep. Resting. He landed opposite me. His wings folded in silence, and his tail flicked once against the moss. He waited. I pressed one claw into the center of the root circle and exhaled into the soil, not with shaping intent but direction. A line grew. Thin, firm, extending southeast out of the glowing garden's heart, beyond the storm island, across the open sea. I felt the shape of the fallen dragon's breath along the edge of the line. Still sleeping. Still marked by that one word. Bewilder beast. I drew the path into the root ring, let it harden into a thread of bark and glowing moss. The storm cutter studied it. He knew what I was asking. Follow it. Find where it begins. Return. But he would not go alone. 2 Skrill emerged from the sky within the hour, answering their alpha silent breath. They circled the island twice, then dropped low into the glowing garden, small, fast, sparking faintly even in the still air. They were not commanders. But they were trackers. The storm cutter joined them without a word. No projection. No wind signal. He simply launched. And they followed. They flew for a full day. I felt them for the first few hours, as long as the shaping roots reached across the vine bridges to the storm island. After that, nothing. The sea was wide and old beyond my reach. A stretch of open salt water where breath could not shape, and roots could not take hold. I shaped a perch on the tallest ridge and waited. Night passed. No return. Daylight again. And then late the following dusk I felt it. A breath not mine. Not shaped. A warning. It came in through the edge of a storm cell high above the glowing garden. I looked up. Lightning flickered once. Then the storm cutter dropped through the clouds, wings locked, body streaked with salt, and eyes wide with contained pressure. He landed hard, followed seconds later by the 2 Skrill, both sparking more than usual, wings shaking from prolonged charge. None of them spoke. But all 3 projected. Straight into the moss at my feet. I saw it. Through their memory. An island. Smaller than ours. High cliffs. Dense forest, but the trees were bent inward, pulled like breath had passed over them too many times without being returned. There was no movement. No birds. No insects. No wind. The surface of the water near the island was frozen. But not naturally. The ice was too thick, too uniform. The edges reached into the trees as if poured from above. Vines beneath the surface were still visible, shaped, once, by dragon breath. Now stopped. And in the center of the island, curled beneath a broken hill, a dragon. Still breathing. Frozen alive. Its eyes were open. But unseeing. Its body stiff, covered in a fine film of ice and frost. And near its flank etched into the ground shaping lines. Not runes. Not human. Dragon breath. Messages left in memory form. The Skrill had tried to read them. Couldn't. But the Stormcutter could. He had learned breath language before me. And what it said chilled more than the ice. We followed. We didn't know. We couldn't stop. Not an attack. Submission. That dragon had surrendered willingly. To a voice that called from below the sea. A voice that offered shelter. A voice that promised order. A voice that froze breath where it stood. I stood motionless as the image faded. The moss beneath my claws did not burn. It did not reject the projection. It only dimmed. As if something in the roots understood it too. Something deeper. The adolescent Stormcutter tilted his head toward me and offered a final memory, the scent of the air near that island. It was familiar. Not dragon. Not soil. Something older. Something that waits. That night, I reshaped the southern ridge. Not a wall. Not yet. But the vines that grew there now held spark not from fire. From Skrill breath. And beneath them, the moss ran cold. Chapter 32, A Spark Beneath Ice. I chose the Alpha Skrill. No one else could go. Not the adolescent Stormcutter, who flew clean but carried too much wind in his presence. Not the ground dragon, whose shaping would draw notice just by standing still. Not the second Foreverwing, whose wings dragged the earth and marked her as one who claimed land, not air. But the Skrill, my Skrill, could vanish between strikes of lightning. He could carry a storm on his back without bringing fire. And when he flew, he left no shape in the soil. He would not go to fight. He would go to speak. We met the next morning in the basin where the vines glowed with residual charge. He stood waiting on the shaped ridge near the storm island, breath thin, wings folded. I sent no wind. He asked no questions. I gave him 3 things. 1 spiral of moss laced with my shaping breath. 1 small stone marked with the memory of the fallen dragon. And silence. He took all 3. Then he flew. No escort. No watchers. No ceremony. Just flight. For 3 days, I felt nothing. No wind disturbance. No return breath through the vines. The sea beyond the edge of shaping was too wide, and I had not reached far enough beneath it to extend my roots that deep. It was the edge of influence. The edge of belonging. And then, on the 4th night, I felt a shift. Not in the island. In the air. He returned during stormlight. The clouds above the storm island bent before him, parting in unnatural silence. He descended slowly, wings still charged, his presence heavier than before. He landed not at the storm basin but directly outside the glowing garden. He did not lower his head. But he shaped breath into the moss immediately. It struck like a wound. Images. Heavy. Cold. Not just frozen dragons. A fleet. Dozens. Wing to wing, eyes blank, breath turned inward. Not lifeless. Owned. And at the center massive. Towering. Skin pale. Horns like glacier-carved stone. Eyes milky and deep. A bewildered beast. Old. Alive. Shaping breath not into growth, not into forest. Into command. And when the Skrill approached bearing my spiral and stone, shaped as peace, as recognition it had not responded in rage. It had smiled. A projection of its own breath came then, and the skrill shared it with me in full clarity. A cold plain. My island, empty of vines. The basin hollow. My roots frozen. My breath locked. And a voice that said one word. Surrender. I stood still. The adolescent storm cutter stepped from the mineral grove, having heard the shaping pulse ripple through the moss. The second Foreverwing came from the southern ridge, wings tense. They felt it too. This wasn't warning. It was war. Not of flame. Not of roar. But of breath. Of will. The alpha skrill did not tremble. He did not lower his wings. But he shaped one final message before stepping back. A single image. A mirror of what the bewilderbeast had shown. Only now I stood in the basin. My roots surged. My vines glowed. And the ice broke. The bewilderbeast wanted my land. Not to destroy. To possess. Because I had done something it could not. Shaped life without control. Dragons who breathed their own breath. Vines that grew not under command, but with choice. A system that did not fear chaos but welcomed it. To the bewilderbeast, that was weakness. To me, it was the island. I would not yield it. Chapter 33, Storm Without Mercy. He stood at the storm basin's edge, surrounded by vines that pulsed with the residual heat of shaping breath and sky fire. The alpha skrill didn't speak. He never did. But his presence was unmistakable, lean, charged, the scent of ozone trailing behind his movements like a shadow. He had stood before the bewilderbeast and returned with a declaration. Not a warning. A statement of intent. The North would not be spared. The island would be taken. And I would either kneel or vanish beneath ice. And now he stood before me, wings half raised, chest angled low, waiting for one thing. Permission. Not to defend. To strike. I said nothing. I walked past him through the center of the basin where stormroot moss curled around the stone that marked the crater of our first shaping and shaped one breath downward. The vines responded immediately. Not with light. With contact. The storm island had not only absorbed skrill breath, it remembered it. Stored it. And now it would answer to it. I let the roots twist outward and upward, curling around a new coil of stone rising from the basin wall. A direction. A target. One of the outer southern islands the storm cutter had scouted weeks ago, abandoned, frost-edged, forgotten. But not lifeless. The frozen dragon had lain just beyond its cliffs. And the scent that still lingered there had not come from time. It had come from control. The bewilderbeast's breath had passed through it. That meant it was vulnerable to interruption. Not assault. Interruption. I shaped one command into the root line. Do not kill. Disrupt. Cripple the control. Burn the silence out of its soil. The alpha skrill exhaled once. His wings rose. And he vanished. They moved faster than I expected. He didn't go alone. 3 more skrill followed him from the cloud line above the storm island, 2 from the lower ridge, 1 from the outer cliffs. Not his chosen kin. Volunteers. They carried no banners. No markings. No roar. Only storm. They flew south. 4 arcs of charge trailing behind them, visible even in the clear sky. And I shaped a perch from the highest part of the glowing garden and watched the horizon until the sea swallowed their flight. I waited. Vines trembled across the southern shaping paths. Not with fear. With readiness. They returned the next morning. Fast. Hard. Alive. But changed. The first came in low, tail trailing sparks, eyes wide but not panicked. His breath crackled across the vines even before he landed. The Alpha followed. He descended slowly, no wounds, but his body hummed with pressure. Not charge. Memory. He landed in the basin and immediately exhaled into the moss. I stepped forward. Saw what he'd seen. The island had been small. Circular. Mostly stone. A few scattered trees warped by ice. The air had been too clean. No insects. No birds. They found 2 dragons still living there, both motionless, both crouched near the center. Eyes open. Breath shallow. Frozen, but not by nature. Their minds were gone. Breath shaped to hold but not breathe. The skrill had not approached them. They struck the center. Not dragons. The shaping structure. At the island's core, buried beneath layers of frost-shaped stone, was a vent, a narrow crack that led deep into the bedrock. It hummed with power. Not cold. Command. A breath that didn't belong to the dragons above it. And so the Alpha had chosen to speak not with words. With storm. They hit it once. Direct. A single blast of concentrated charge into the shaping vent. The earth screamed. Not cracked, rejected. Frost exploded from the core. The dragons above didn't die. They collapsed. Eyes shut. Breath stopped curling into command. The wind stopped moving. And in that moment, the presence that had hovered across the island's shape, it fled. The bewildered beast pulled its breath back. Retreated from that island. Not defeated. But cut off. The projection ended. The moss quieted. The storm cutter stood nearby, tail twitching. He had seen the same memory. He looked at me once, silent. The Alpha skrill did not move. He had delivered his message. Not a victory. A proof. The bewildered beast could be challenged. Not by roar. By interruption. I reshaped the storm basin that afternoon. Let the moss curve into coils of hardened vine and mineral-stiffened bark. Not just for the skrill. For any dragon who would fly for freedom. Not conquest. Not power. Freedom of breath. Chapter 34, A Voice Beneath the Vines. The storm basin had gone still. Not from exhaustion. Not from fear. From clarity. The Alpha skrill had proven what I suspected, the bewildered beast's hold was not invincible. Its breath, though wide and commanding, could be severed from land. Dragons who had been frozen bound by silent shaping collapsed once the source of that shaping was disrupted. The ice cracked. The control retreated. It did not die. It withdrew. That was not mercy. It was calculation. And so I waited. I shaped nothing that day. Did not speak to the adolescent storm cutter. Did not press vines further south. I stood in the glowing garden's basin, my claws deep in the moss, my breath slow, and I listened. The bewildered beast had not responded with cold. Not immediately. It would respond another way. The answer came at dusk. Not in the air. In the roots. It started beneath the edge of the vine path that connected the glowing garden to the storm island, where the moss curled thick around the base of the shaping arch. I felt a shift. Not a tremble. Not a breath. A presence. Something pressed into the vines. Not from the surface. From beneath. Deep. A shaping breath, not mine. Not skrill. Older. Slower. More deliberate. And it didn't reach the island like a scout. It pushed like a tide. I lowered my head to the moss and pressed my breath downward. The root veins beneath me lit faintly. And then I heard it. Not words. Not noise. A shape. A projection so vast, so old, it didn't move through the air, it moved through memory. The roots didn't resist it. They froze. The moss curled inward. The light from the vines dimmed, not with heat, but with cold intention. And then the voice formed in the root line. Not as sound. As declaration. You have taken one. It echoed. Not once. Not twice. With each beat of the shaping breath beneath the soil, it grew louder, not in volume, but in certainty. I gave them peace. It didn't shout. It didn't growl. The soil beneath me accepted the breath without consent. And then the final words came. Clear. Unavoidable. I will take 10. Then the root snapped. Not mine. His. The shaping presence recoiled instantly, pulling itself out of the vine network with precision. Not rage. Tactic. The connection was severed in seconds. But not before I felt it. The direction. The bewildered beast wasn't just watching. It had traced the line of shaping breath the skrill left behind after their strike. It had learned the structure of my island. Its root network. Its centers. And now it had marked them. Not to destroy. To take. I opened the shaping circle at the center of the glowing garden before the wind even shifted. The adolescent storm cutter arrived within the hour. The second Foreverwing followed from the ridge, vines trailing behind her wings. The alpha skrill did not land. He circled overhead. Watching. Waiting. The moment I shaped the warning into the moss, they all saw it. 10 targets. 10 dragons. Not just mine. Any. It would not come in a single strike. It would not freeze the island all at once. It would peel us apart. One by one. Until our roots weakened. Until silence took hold. Until the bewildered beast could step forward, not with force. With inevitability. But it had made one mistake. It had shaped breath into my soil. And now I knew its signature. Its weight. Its movement. I could feel its breath beneath the ocean. And I would follow it. Chapter 35, The Silence That Resists. He had never left the mineral grove. Not once. Not when the adolescent storm cutter first flew out past the storm line and came back dripping sea mist. Not when the second Foreverwing pressed her vines into the southern ridge and shaped walls without asking. Not even when the alpha skrill returned from the southern island crackling with static, wings heavy from proximity to the bewildered beast. The ground dragon had simply remained. He did not speak. He did not project. He shaped. Constantly. Quietly. Inward. His breath curled deep into the base of the island, further down than even my shaping had reached, deeper than the chamber beneath the disk. I never asked what he found. I never could. His shaping didn't move like mine: plant, vine, root, canopy. His breath traveled like stone made to remember. Like the crust of the earth was something that could be taught to push back. And when the bewildered beast's voice passed through our root line cold, complete, promising to take 10, he still did not move. Until now. It began at dawn. The moss just beginning to recover from the shaping tremor left behind by the bewildered beast's projection. The air was thick with stillness. The adolescent storm cutter hadn't slept. He circled above the storm basin, checking for cold. Then the earth changed. Not the island. The base of the island. A sound, not from wind or wing. From below. The moss near the mineral grove hardened. Stone cracked but did not break. And then the ground dragon moved. Slow. Deliberate. He stepped into the central basin of the glowing garden for the first time since his shaping breath had joined mine. He did not roar. He did not breathe flame. He simply lowered his massive head toward the ground. And shaped. The effect was immediate. Not flash. Not spark. Density. The soil beneath us stopped vibrating. All the vines went quiet. Even the charged ones that curled up from the storm island dimmed. Not dead. Not muted. Just, rooted. Unmoving. Grounded. His breath didn't shape outward. It shaped against. And when the bewilderbeast's presence brushed the farthest edge of our shaping paths that night, it hit something it hadn't felt before. A resistance that didn't reflect. Didn't fight. Didn't engage. It simply didn't yield. I watched the ground dragon as he continued, breath slow, thick with weight. Not pressure. Certainty. The roots he shaped didn't carry memory the way mine did. They carried refusal. The vines that coiled out from the mineral grove weren't green anymore. They were dark, brittle-looking, but unbreakable. Where my moss curled to accept shaping, his pressed down flattened, silent, firm. He didn't close the island. He anchored it. The adolescent storm cutter landed beside me as the shaping passed through the central ridge. He watched it settle. His feathers twitched once, then stilled. This breath is not like ours, he said. I answered by lowering my tail into the moss. Letting it sink. Even I couldn't shape through the hardened root bed the ground dragon had laid. Not yet. Not unless I asked. It was not isolation. It was defense. The second Foreverwing came the next day. She pressed one vine into the newly shaped moss near the mineral grove and recoiled slightly. Not in pain. In recognition. She tried to shape along its edges. Nothing moved. Then she stepped back. And circled the new shaping once. Then again. And finally, pressed her breath in lightly. Not to control. To learn. And the root allowed it. For the first time, I realized something I had ignored since the shaping began weeks ago. My island was not only breath and vine. It had become a structure. Storm above. Growth across. Stone beneath. And now resistance. The ground dragon had shaped not a shield. A foundation. And the bewilderbeast's breath would have to cross it if it wanted to reach us again. That night, I stood in the basin and pressed a thin root downward. Not into soil. Into his shaping. And I let my breath curl just along its surface. For a moment, I felt what he felt. Not fire. Not spark. Not life. Just weight. Not the kind that crushed. The kind that held. And I shaped one thought into the moss around him. Thank you. He did not answer. But he stepped forward. One step. Closer. And that was enough. Chapter 36, The Quiet One Lost. The island was sealed now. Not closed but sealed. The ground dragon's shaping had spread across the basin like the weight of thought pressing down through centuries. Vines moved slower, moss no longer pulsed in soft light at night, and the root line refused the smallest foreign breath that tried to pass through it. Nothing touched us without being permitted. It was protection. But it came with silence. We had never needed to speak often, but now even our thoughts moved more slowly. And the bewilderbeast knew it. Because the pressure didn't come from beneath anymore. It came from the edges. The first was a young hobble grunt. She nested near the eastern cliffs, hunting close to the ocean's edge, too far for the deep root shaping to cover her fully. One of the Stormcutter's scouts had been flying over the ridge when the breath pulse broke. Faint. Frozen. A silence that should have been life. I went myself. Took the adolescent Stormcutter in a single skrill. The eastern cliffs sloped down toward shallow beachhead, where the vines no longer grew as thick, and the breath of the garden didn't reach fully. We landed silently. No shaping. No sound. I let my claws press into the soil to test the memory. It was still warm. The hobble grunt had been alive only hours ago. She'd roamed in a tight circle then gone still. No drag marks. No struggle. No sign of pain. Just a stop. I pressed deeper into the sand. Shaped low. And found it. A ring. Thin. Tight. Pressed into the stone like breath had curled around it and held not long enough to root, just long enough to pass through. Not a projection. Not a presence. A sample. A test. I showed it to the storm cutter. He bowed his head. His wings lifted slightly in tension. She didn't fight, he murmured. She just obeyed. I looked toward the sea. No ice. No broken earth. Just wind. And far below, the smell of memory not ours. We returned. And I called him to me that night. Not the skrill. Not the ground dragon. The storm cutter. He stood beside the mineral grove beneath a tree that still held lightning-bent bark from the first shaping of the storm island. You want me to track it, he said. I said nothing. He already knew. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask if I was sure. He only lowered his head toward the basin, then lifted his wings and rose into the sky. He flew east. Past the edge of the cliffs. Beyond the root line. Where the soil no longer held names. I returned to the basin and waited. Time passed. Moss shifted with the memory of recent warmth. But no shape came back through the roots. Not until sunset. He projected first. From the wind. Not images. Smell. Memory of frozen breath caught in midair. Dragons mid-motion. Stiff. But not attacked. Not broken. Like they had heard something. Then paused. And never unpaused. He landed 2 hours later, body stiff from wind cold. His breath shaped directly into the moss beside me. He'd seen another one. A natter. Perched upright in a tree. Alive. Breathing. But eyes open. Empty. Its wings still twitching in the cold air. Waiting for a command. The bewildered beast was not attacking. Not testing borders. It was sampling. Marking out which dragons were too far to protect. Which ones could be taken without a single strike. Not a siege. A harvest. I lowered my head to the moss and shaped outward through every part of the network that reached the edges. Every outcropping. Every cliff. Every thinning patch of vines. And I pulled everything back. All dragons beyond the shaping line were to return. Not to hide. To regroup. Because now I understood the message behind the projection. I will take 10 wasn't a threat. It was a promise. One at a time. Silently. Until no one noticed anymore. Chapter 37, The hatchling sees the stillness. I felt her before I saw her. The shaping lines across the eastern ridge shifted subtly, like a ripple passed through moss that hadn't been touched. The roots curled, not from pressure, but from recognition. The breath that approached carried both light and question, and it moved too fast to be one of the older dragons, too light-footed to be the second Foreverwing. The hatchling had returned. I turned from the basin and walked toward the outer path. She came over the vine bridge in full motion, wings half open, tail dragging behind her like a ribbon of loose root, face bright, eyes wide, carrying the last breath of the storm island in her lungs. She had shaped while she was gone. I could feel it in the way the moss responded to her claws, more responsive now, more confident. She landed at the edge of the shaping slope and exhaled toward me. It wasn't a greeting. It was a question. I answered by stepping forward and lowering my head slightly, an invitation. She ran up the slope and slowed only once she was within my shadow. She looked around. The moss didn't pulse. The trees didn't curl their roots upward. The air didn't buzz with growth. Only silence. Her head tilted. Why is the island scared? I didn't lie. But I didn't tell the whole truth either. I shaped a small circle in the moss between us and let her step into it. Her claws brushed against the roots, some of them fresh from the ground dragon's breath, others still holding faint spark from the storm basin. She flinched once, then crouched. I can feel something, she said. Like someone's watching. Not seeing. Watching. I nodded once. Then I shaped a memory, not one of mine. One of the storm cutters. The frozen natter. Eyes open. Wings locked. Perched on a tree like it had simply chosen not to move anymore. The hatchling took one breath and then fell completely still. Her pupils narrowed. Not in fear. In something more dangerous. Awareness. That's not death, she whispered. That's breath without will. I didn't speak. She stepped backward, still watching the image. Then she turned toward the glowing garden and stared at the basin for a long time. So it's coming, she said. Not to burn. Not to break. To collect. I shaped affirmation into the moss at her feet. A single pulse. She stepped into it. Let it rise over her claws. Then exhaled once. And asked the question I had waited for. What can I do? I took her to the storm basin that evening. Let her stand where the alpha skrill had once shaped the air in defiance. She touched the crater's edge and pressed her breath into the root bowl. It responded slowly at first, then with something more. Not just growth. A crackle. A pulse. The vines that formed under her claw didn't curl upward. They sparked. Low. Steady. Intentional. She turned to me, eyes wide. I thought I could only shape with root. But the air listens too. It wasn't lightning. Not yet. But it was more than moss. It was the first sign of evolution. That night, I watched her sleep in the crater. The moss shaped around her body by its own memory of her presence. Her tail twitched once. Her breath came slow. And from deep below the stone, I felt the bewilderbeast's projection move again. Not toward her. Around her. Circling. Measuring. Waiting for a sign that she was vulnerable. She wasn't. Not anymore. Chapter 38, Storm in the Bones. She stood across from him with her wings folded tight, tail brushing lightly against the cracked moss of the basin. She didn't flinch, didn't tremble, not when he exhaled lightning into the stone at her feet, not when the air twisted from the pressure of his body moving through it. The alpha skrill tilted his head. He had taught no one before. He didn't lower himself to speak. But he shaped a small arc of air beneath his claws, and the ground rippled with it. Not a message. A challenge. She didn't look to me. She stepped into the ripple and pressed her own shaping breath into the stone. The moss curled once. Then sparked. Faint. Weak. But it sparked. And that was enough. He leapt. The first training session was not a lesson. It was contact. The alpha skrill didn't speak in breath. He moved in pressure. When he circled her, the air thickened. When he exhaled, the moss across the basin responded before she did. She tried to follow him, her wings too wide, her body too heavy with root memory, but she didn't fall. Not once. He twisted through the updrafts above the crater and let sparks trail from his claws. Then dove. She ducked too late. The air burned past her flank, harmless but hot. She growled, not loud. Not angry. But frustrated. He answered by twisting back over her, claws tucking as he inverted and dropped lightning into the vines below. She watched how the sparks curled, how they pulsed before vanishing. She stepped forward and tried again. This time she didn't shape a root. She shaped pressure. It took until dusk before she struck the air correctly. She was panting. Her chest was heaving. But she kept moving. And then, in one moment, she leapt. She turned. And she shaped a breath not into the ground, not into the vines, but into the sky. And it answered. The lightning didn't crack. It curled. A thin arc, low and golden, trailing from her mouth to her shoulder, wrapping her like a coil. She froze in place, shocked, but not hurt. The skrill descended immediately, wings tight, tail slashing the air with speed. He circled her twice. Not inspecting. Guarding. And then he bowed. Only slightly. But it was real. The hatchling had shaped spark from air. And it had not killed her. It had recognized her. I watched from the ridge, my claws sunk into the moss just far enough to taste the residue of her breath. It was not mine. Not storm. Not forest. It was both. And it was beginning to grow fast. She slept beside the storm basin that night. Not curled beside me. She was too charged, now her body still pulsing with shallow spark. The moss hummed beneath her, but didn't burn. The vines had learned her presence. And she had begun to forget the fear. The storm had accepted her. The alpha skrill remained on watch, perched high above the crater on a shaped pillar of stone I had left for him weeks ago. He didn't move. But his breath curled slowly into the air. And I understood. She was no longer just a hatchling. She was becoming a weapon. Chapter 39, Two Lights Go Out. We knew the bewildered beast wouldn't stop. He had spoken his breath into my roots, declared his intention plainly, left no ambiguity. I will take 10. He was not shouting for obedience or raging against defiance. He was simply counting. We had taken one of his islands. He had answered. Then we disrupted the shaping flow of a second. He answered again. This time, he did not test the eastern cliffs or circle near the storm island. He reached for the west. The vines at the edge of the cliff shook once before they went quiet. Not from wind. Not from breath. From removal. I was walking the inner basin near the adolescent stormcutter's perch when the first silence struck. The moss under my claws snapped, not shattered, but withdrawn. A curling root line that had extended along the westward shaping path simply ceased. Like it had never been shaped. I pressed downward with my breath. Nothing answered. Not rejection. Absence. I turned immediately and walked west across the canopy bridges, the moss beneath my feet already starting to curl defensively. The ground dragon's shaping had reached this far. His stone root networks pulled at the deeper breath beneath the cliffs, but even that resistance had not stopped what came next. The adolescent storm cutter caught the shift 2 heartbeats later. He flew out ahead. By the time we reached the edge of the cliffs, there was no movement. No wind. No scent. No light. Only the hollow where 2 dragons had once moved through the vines. One was a whispering death, an older survivor who had lived in a tunnel beneath the western ridge. He rarely flew. He didn't attend council. But he maintained the southern mineral flows with obsessive precision, shaping breath through stone, balancing deep pressure. The other, a young Gronkel, had only recently begun flying patrols. He'd asked me once if he could shape the outer wall with the second Foreverwing, and I had agreed. She'd liked his calmness. She'd called him reliable. Now both were gone. There were no wounds. No burn. No frost. Just nothing. The adolescent storm cutter landed beside the ridge and paced once along the outer edge. He pressed his breath into the moss. It curled. Then lit. Not with spark. With message. A word. Shaped not by us. Obedient. One breath. Pressed shallow into the outer moss, like a claw had scratched it without carving. No scent. No weight. Just shaping. And then quiet. He had taken two. And he wanted me to know. We called no council. There was no need. The second Foreverwing arrived at the basin before I summoned her. The Alpha Skrill landed just outside the garden's ridge. He didn't approach. He didn't shape breath. But his wings were already angled in preparation. The hatchling came last. She didn't speak. She walked into the crater, pressed her breath into the rootbed and found the word waiting. Obedient. She flinched. Not from fear. From recognition. What does it mean? She asked. I stared down at the mark in the moss. It means he's counting, I said. And we're behind. The storm cutter didn't wait for orders. That night, he gathered 5 dragons, 2 natters, 1 young flight mare, 1 typhomerang, and a middle-aged thunderdrum and shaped a perimeter ring around the island. He placed them in a staggered formation across the southern, eastern, and now the western sky. The Alpha Skrill didn't join them. He stayed above the crater, eyes locked on the clouds. Waiting. Not to strike. To intercept. I stood alone beneath the mineral grove. I pressed my breath deep. And I began to shape something I had not yet revealed. A seed. Old. Buried. Dormant until now. I shaped it into a vine that would not answer to surface breath. If he wanted to take 10, I would learn how to steal them back. Chapter 40, Breath that Reaches Back. I shaped it beneath the garden. Not beside the vines or between the moss paths or under the ridges shaped by the ground dragon's weight, too exposed, too open. I shaped it deep, under the soil that remembered none of us. Not even me. I had never shaped there before. Not with this kind of breath. This wasn't a shaping of growth. It wasn't for storm. Or shelter. Or strength. It was a reversal. The idea had come the moment the second dragon vanished. When I saw the empty soil where the whispering death should have been, when I felt the still warm moss where the gronkel had shaped just the day before, I understood something I had only half believed until then. The bewildered beast didn't need to destroy us to win. He didn't need to conquer the land. Didn't need to silence our vines. Didn't need to win in battle. He needed only to change what dragons thought breath was for. No longer connection. No longer shaping. Only obedience. He reached inward. Not to kill. To repurpose. If he could reach us, reshape us, use us against each other, then the war would end before it ever started. So I would reach back. I shaped the recovery line under the Storm Island's fractured rim where the Alpha Skrill had first landed after disrupting the vent of the frozen island. The breath marks there were faint, but still lingering. The dragons he had cut free of the shaping core had fallen, unconscious, breath silent. But they had lived. Not for long. But long enough for me to understand something else. The bewilderbeast's hold was not absolute. It was sustained. If cut sharply enough, with the right kind of breath, it failed. Not immediately. But enough to sever his command. I shaped a net. Not of vines. Not of stone. Of memory. Memory I'd taken from those dragons when I pressed into the soil and found their thoughts still tangled in frost. Small images, a heatless sky, a single horn curling above ice, a voice that shaped not with words but with weight. They hadn't been taken by a roar. They'd been offered stillness. And they'd accepted it. So I shaped a breath that rejected stillness. The net formed slowly, woven from my breath and the silent pressure of the ground dragon's stone shaping. Rooted not in vine but in resonance. Each line shaped to pull back, not forward. Each node patterned after the moments before silence had fallen. What did the nadir see before it froze? What thought had the gronkel carried when it failed to exhale? Where did the whispering death believe it was going, before its tunnel went quiet? I shaped answers to those questions into the earth. Not to ask them again. To restore them. The hatchling found me while I worked. She approached softly, too softly for the vines to catch. But I felt the shift in the stone where she stepped. The pressure of breath she hadn't yet shaped into language. "Are you making something to fight him?" she asked. "No." "Then what is it?" I didn't look up. I let my breath flow outward, forming a ring of soft tension beneath the shaping disc I'd placed at the garden's far edge. "I'm making something to remind dragons who they were before he spoke." She stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the formation. "It's slow." "It has to be," I said. "His breath moves fast because it doesn't care where it lands. Mine has to find what was lost." She didn't answer. She sat beside me, wings curled, and watched in silence. That night, I finished the first layer. Only a fragment. But it pulsed. Not with spark. With resistance. Now I needed a dragon to test it. One that had been silenced. One that was still breathing. One not too far gone. The storm cutter knew where to find her. The frozen nadir on the cliff. Chapter 41, Touch the Silent. The net was ready. Not completed. Not perfect. But ready. Its shape was unfamiliar, less like a trap, more like an echo suspended in breath. I had built it beneath the old basin stone of the storm island, letting the memory threads stretch across the stone veins laid by the ground dragon's shaping. It was thin, impossibly delicate, and steeped in intent so dense that even I could barely breathe near its center. It wasn't alive. But it wanted to be. The storm cutter came before I called. Of course he did. He stepped out of the east wind like it was his breath that had shaped the gust, feathers rippling faintly as his talons tapped the outer rim of the basin. He said nothing. Only looked down into the shaping hollow where the net pulsed gently against the moss, low, slow, like an unformed name waiting to be spoken. I met his eyes. He nodded once. He did not fly fast. Not this time. His wings stretched wide, but his movement was restrained. Controlled. Not just because the nadir was fragile, not just because we didn't know how close the bewilderbeast's shaping still lingered, because he understood what she represented. She had been taken. Now we were trying to pull her back. That was not a mission. That was something closer to hope. She hadn't moved since the last time we'd seen her. Perched exactly where she'd been frozen, high in a warped pine at the edge of the west cliffs. No wind disturbed her feathers. No breath passed her nostrils. But she was alive. I had felt it through the moss the moment she came into range. Her heart still beat, slow and small and utterly restrained. He hovered above her for 2 full breaths before descending. He didn't touch her with his claws. He wrapped his wings around her in a tight circle, shaped a silent pulse of air. And lifted. She didn't resist. She didn't react at all. I felt her coming before I saw her. Her breath passed like water across the shaping lines, barely forming pressure. The net responded immediately. Not in panic. Not in heat. In invitation. The storm cutter laid her down at the center of the shaping hollow, inside the coiled ring I had formed with the ground dragon's stone and my moss-threaded shaping line. She did not move. Not even her eyes. The hatchling arrived next. Her spark breath disturbed the air around the net, but I held up my tail before she stepped too close. Not yet. Not this time. I pressed my own claws into the inner ring and exhaled a threaded breath, a pulse not of command, not of shaping, but of memory. Into the net. Into her. The shaping took hold. Not all at once. Like frost melting from a blade edge, not in heat, but in recognition. I watched the breath I had layered through the net rise slowly into the still air above her snout. She twitched. Once. Her eyes didn't open. But her wing jerked faintly, like a dragon in the first stages of sleep. The hatchling moved beside me. Is it working? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Then she breathed. Sharp. Painful. Wrong. Like her lungs didn't remember how to move. Then again. This time slower. She inhaled shaping breath. And rejected it. The moss beneath her twisted. Not in spiral. In recoil. The shaping net fluttered, like it was about to break. I stepped closer. Pressed more memory into the lines. I shaped before, the moment before she froze, the feeling of air, of root, of not being alone. Her eyes opened. Faint. Glossy. She didn't speak. Didn't move her neck. But her claws gripped the soil under her. And her breath continued. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was hers. The stormcutter stood watch over her through the night. The hatchling curled beside her not for comfort, but because the spark in her breath had aligned with the way the shaping lines in the net moved. The natter's tail twitched once during the dark cycle. And her breath, though slow, held. She wasn't free. Not fully. But she was no longer his. Chapter 42, What We Choose to Awaken. The second Foreverwing came at sunrise. The ridge vines bowed in her wake, their leaves folding in to shelter from the pressure of her wingspan. The air thickened with the weight of her breath even before she stepped into the storm basin. She didn't need to speak. But she did. I met her at the lip of the shaping hollow, where the moss still held the faded curve of the natter's form. The net was quiet now. Dormant, but not inactive. Memory shaped into its core continued to pulse slowly beneath the stone, tuned to her breath and only hers. It would not respond to mine again. She lay in the center, eyes closed, but no longer frozen. She twitched when touched. Shifted weight. Exhaled unshaped breath on her own. It was working. Too slowly. But working. The second Foreverwing saw all of this before she addressed me. Her breath curved slightly across the moss between us, no projection. Just pressure. You intend to keep her between states? I nodded. You should not. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. She stepped forward, her tail dragging along the edge of the stone-pressed vines shaped by the ground dragon weeks earlier. They didn't resist her. They parted. Shredder, she said softly, and her voice was deep enough to shift the roots beneath her claws. I know what you are doing. I feel its shape through the basin. I said nothing. She turned her head slightly, toward the natter's still form. She is not healed. She is separated. The bewildered beast still holds the other half of her breath. She breathes on her own, I said. She breathes in absence. Not in clarity. That is not return. That is fracture. Her gaze turned toward me again. If you sever him completely, he will know. I stepped forward. Only once. You're afraid, I said. She didn't retreat. I remember the ice, Shredder. I remember the silence that touched this land long before you came to shape it. We build our roots slow because we must feel what stays. If you break his hold, if you call her back in full, he will not respond with shaping breath next time. She paused. Then added, he will come with force. The hatchling stepped out from behind the ridge tree then, small and unannounced. She had watched from the edge of the net's pulse point since before dawn, her spark breath curling softly in the air. She came forward slowly. The second Foreverwing looked down at her without speaking. The hatchling stepped beside the natter. Watched her twitch once. "She's still in there," she said. "She's scared. But she's in there." The second Foreverwing didn't answer. The hatchling turned to me. "I can shape another breath into the net. One that doesn't burn. Just reminds her she's home." The older dragon growled faintly. "And if that breath breaks the thread that keeps her breathing at all?" The hatchling didn't back down. "She's already not breathing right. We either call her back or lose her slow." I looked down at the net. Its threads pulsed faintly in the moss. The memory lines I had shaped into the soil were still active, still moving, but they had slowed. The initial shaping had called her to the edge of herself. But she was now trapped in the middle. Half free. Half gone. The second Foreverwing was right. I was keeping her in stasis. Not safe. Stalled. But the bewildered beast had to feel the difference. If I took her back completely, if her breath rejoined mine and refused his, he would know. Not because she was missing. Because she was no longer obedient. And then he would act. Not through shaping. Through war. I looked to the hatchling. Her breath was steady. Focused. Ready to shape. The second Foreverwing lowered her head beside mine. "If you do this, we will lose the shield of ambiguity. We will no longer be a resistance. We will be a threat." I nodded once. "Yes," I said. "That's the point." And so we shaped. The hatchling exhaled first. A soft spark. Not loud. Not wide. But true. It didn't burn. It didn't charge. It settled across the net like a low heartbeat, threading into the stone I'd shaped with my deepest memory line. The moss lifted. The vines curled. The natter's claws gripped the soil. And then she inhaled. Hard. Full. And screamed. Not a roar. Not a command. A scream of existence. Like a breath that had not been allowed to speak for days, had just remembered what sound was. The moss exploded outward in a half circle. The shaping net shattered into silence. But she was awake. Her eyes locked on mine. And her breath was hers. The second Foreverwing didn't speak again. She turned, and walked to the edge of the storm basin. And began shaping the outer ridge thicker. Wider. He would come. Soon. Chapter 43, When the Deep Moves. The wind shifted. Not overhead. Beneath. It began like breath exhaled from lungs the size of the seabed, slow, steady, impossibly wide. The roots I had extended into the ocean floor to track shaping paths began to strain under pressure I hadn't shaped for. Even the deep stonework the ground dragon had forged, the most unmoving, unbreathable base of our island, tensed. He didn't speak. He didn't project a warning. He simply moved. I stood at the storm basin, claws buried in the moss where the shaping net had shattered. The natter lay nearby, fully breathing now. Her sleep was uneasy, her breath occasionally catching in her throat. But she was herself again. Entirely. I had done it. And he knew. The warning came from the western vines first, far below the old cliffs where the whispering death once nested. Not air pressure. Not wind. A dragging force. Massive. Silent. Slow. The adolescent storm cutter circled overhead before I called him. He landed hard and shook once. His voice was clipped. "I felt it in the sky," he said. "Not sound. Displacement. I nodded. He's moving. I reached into the ocean-shaping lines. Extended the deep route, one I had only formed to monitor, not to resist. Now I listened. The seabed beneath the far western trench was no longer still. The layers of shaping breath I had once traced in the dark, just thin frost echoes in old stone, were now moving laterally. Pushed aside. Replaced. Something enormous had dislodged itself. Not ice. Body. I traced it carefully. Slowly. The shaping lines held under the water, even through the cracks in the crusted coral shelf. I pushed a thin thread of breath forward and immediately felt the strain of return. Too much mass. He was no longer sending his breath through projection. He was sending his body. The bewildered beast was coming. Not across the sky. Not in flame. But through the ocean floor. Beneath us. The Alpha Skrill descended an hour later. He did not land in the basin. He perched just behind the second Foreverwing, where she had begun shaping a secondary wall at the edge of the western cliffs. No words. No breath. Only alignment. The storm cutter moved next, flying slow circles above the basin, leaving pockets of pressure as he dipped through the updrafts. His wings weren't open in readiness. They were open in acceptance. We wouldn't be ready. We would stand. The hatchling approached silently. Her spark breath still left a trail when she walked. She looked up at me. You felt it? I nodded. She turned her head west. Eyes narrow. Tail low. Will he come alone? No, I said. He'll bring the sea. I walked into the basin and shaped every thread I had ever buried. Called all vines inward. Let the moss curl back into itself. The shaping garden dimmed. The lights faded. Not in surrender. In focus. Across the basin, the nadir stirred. She rose slowly, her body still remembering what it meant to choose. She limped to the edge of the shaping circle and lowered her head. She was still afraid. But she stood with us. The ground dragon moved for the second time in as many days. He did not speak. He shaped downward, hardening the underlayers of the western trench. It would not stop the bewildered beast. But it would make him earn every root he tried to pull from us. There would be no breath exchange this time. No test. No projection. Only presence. We had pulled one dragon back. He was coming to take 10 more. Chapter 44, The Sea That Stood Still. I felt it before it moved. Before the shaping lines cracked. Before the breath beneath the island began to curl back into itself like a root sensing frost. The sea was not rising. It was lifting. The ground dragon had felt it first long before the moss bent, long before the adolescent storm cutter flew out over the cliffs and circled in widening loops. I hadn't even noticed at first. Too busy rechecking the shattered shaping net, reinforcing the nadir's pulse line, preparing for a return breath that might never come. But the shaping beneath the garden didn't lie. The weight changed. And then it began. Not a wave. Not a storm surge. A heave. Like something had moved beneath the ocean and displaced its weight not in a violent burst, but in a slow, deliberate shift that pushed entire layers of water upward. The western edge of the sky dimmed with mist. Not from clouds. From lifted sea. It didn't collapse. It didn't rush forward. It simply hovered, suspended above its natural place, held in perfect balance by shaping breath so vast it couldn't be measured. He was rising. I stood at the western ridge with the second Foreverwing beside me, her claws sunk into stone that had begun to tremble. Not from quaking earth, not from tectonic movement, but from the sheer presence of volume. She did not shape. She simply watched. As did the Alpha Skrill, perched higher up on the ridge, tail twitching, wings flexing in half-formed arcs. The adolescent storm cutter had flown inland, forming a circular pattern with his patrols, redirecting dragons toward higher shaping zones. He knew. They all knew. The sea wasn't coming to kill us. It was coming to carry him. The hatchling appeared late. She didn't speak. She looked up at the sky, where water now lingered unnaturally above the western horizon like a second sky of glass held in a single breath, and she whispered one thing. He's not just moving. I turned to her. He's displaying. He wanted us to see the weight of his breath. To know what kind of body required the sea to rise. To remember that this wasn't a battle of force, it was a lesson. We had pulled a dragon back. Now he would show us what resistance costs. The nadir came next. Walking. No longer unsteady. She moved through the moss like she'd never left. Her tail no longer dragged. Her head no longer tilted sideways in confusion. She had shaped no breath since waking. But she had watched. Now she stood beside me and exhaled a single memory line. He rose like this before. I turned. She wasn't looking at the sea. She was looking at the basin. The day before he took my voice. She remembered more than we thought. The ocean trembled again. Not with movement. With mass. The wall of suspended water folded once at its highest point, then froze again. A curved silhouette began to emerge behind it. Wide. Horned. Crowned in shaping ice. I did not shape my breath. Not yet. But the moss around my feet began to pulse in preparation. The ground dragon stepped forward. He did not look up. He shaped downward. His breath entered the earth. And the cliff hardened. The shaping vines that connected the basin to the sea pulled inward, tightening around their cores, not retreating but coiling. Ready to spring. Not yet, I whispered. To no one in particular. The hatchling's eyes glowed faintly. What's he doing? She asked. And I said the only thing I could. He's waiting for us to blink first. The alpha skrill moved. Only once. From his perch, he exhaled a single pulse of storm breath, not toward the sea, but straight into the clouds above. It arced once. Twice. And then shattered the silence. A flash of charged pressure followed. Not an attack. A signal. He had taken position. We would not blink. The wall of lifted sea began to ripple now, tiny pulses cascading down the sides like folds in thick glass. He was close. So close we could feel the shaping breath curling around the bottom edges of the island's rude network. The second Foreverwing turned to me. He'll breach soon. I nodded. He'll rise slowly, she added. He wants us to see his full size. He wants us to measure it. I pressed my claws into the moss. Let my breath coil beneath the net remains. And shaped only one thought into the root line. I see him. And I am still here. Chapter 45, He Sends a Dragon. The sea broke like breath splitting in silence. Not in sound. Not in fury. In design. No wave. No surge. Just parting water, lifted as if by invisible claws, held above the ocean's own weight. The bewildered beast did not emerge all at once. Only a single arc first, the horn. Tall. Curved. Engraved in ice that shaped itself as it rose, runes not for language, but for presence. Then the crown. Massive. Ringed with ancient scars, rimmed in white. And behind it movement. Not the beast. The shaped. He sent a dragon. Not thrown. Not hurled. Raised. She came through the mist slowly, her breath still frozen in a half-formed exhale, eyes open but unfocused. A monstrous nightmare. Scales dark with soot burn, rimmed in a frost that didn't come from cold. From command. The water did not touch her. It carried her. Lifted her like a queen on a silent throne, suspended in breath too large for her own body. She moved without resistance, her wings trailing downward, claws curled under as if still dreaming. The first word that shaped in the vines beneath me was not mine. It was hers. Help. The second Foreverwing stepped forward first, body tensed, vines rising behind her. I blocked her. She didn't fight it. The alpha Skrill dropped from the ridge with a blast of wind that rocked the basin's outer wall. He landed, claws flexed. Storm crackled through his spine. But he didn't move toward her. Not yet. He could feel it too. She wasn't shaped like the others. She had not been taken all at once. She had been shaped and preserved. The hatchling stepped forward beside me. What is she? She whispered. She's a lesson, I said. From him. I nodded once. Not to us. Then to who? I exhaled. To her. The monstrous nightmare touched down at the base of the western ridge as if the sea set her gently onto the shaping moss. She staggered only once. Her body moved like it remembered weight, but not balance. She looked up. And her eyes found me. No challenge. No hatred. Only pain. And a message. Not spoken. Not shaped. But burned into her breath. A memory she couldn't unhold. I stepped forward and lowered my tail into the moss. Pressed breath into the roots gently, not to connect, only to feel what still lived inside her. And I saw it. His breath. But not holding her. Echoing. She had broken free once. And he had let her live. Had shaped her again. Not to erase her memory. But to amplify it. She carried the knowledge of defeat. And now he sent her as proof. I spoke. Not aloud. Into the moss, between the cracks of her shaping breath. You remember what he did? She nodded, slow. Painfully. You still breathe. Her claws curled against the moss. And her breath pulsed slow. Real. She was alive. But her body was trained to move when he called. Even now. Even here. He had sent not a warning. Not a weapon. A survivor. To show us what would remain after we disobeyed. She collapsed before we could reach her. Not from harm. From tension. Like her body had spent too long fighting orders she could no longer disobey. The ground dragon moved first this time. He emerged from the shaping grove in silence and pressed his breath downward. The moss beneath her shifted into stone gently, not to restrain, but to hold. She would not fall deeper. She would not shape again tonight. But she had arrived. And her arrival changed everything. The second Foreverwing turned to me as the sea wall trembled. He doesn't need to kill us, she said quietly. He only needs to send enough broken ones for the rest to follow. I looked out across the lifted water. He sent her, I whispered, so the others would doubt the point of resisting. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because he had just proved what we feared most. That not all who returned from him were saved.